Okay, check 1 2. Check 1 2. Testing. Please let me know in the chat how the sound is. Hit the thumbs up button. This one, the like button, as everybody calls it. It really helps fuel the algorithm. We should have a really good stream today, guys. I almost made it. Almost made it to at 3 p.m. So we're definitely making serious progress. Sundays, I hope, is a better time for everybody. But if you have any thoughts on it, please let me know in the live chat. Hello, Paulina. Hello. Would be nice. That's fine. But yeah, sounds good. Good to hear. So today we are going to have a great stream. I think we're going to talk about a discussion that was between Michael Levin and Carlos Farias, I think is how you pronounce his last name. This is Carlos's channel, and it is basically a metaphysics and complexity and meaning channel, which is very relevant to this one, Theory of Every0ne. It says, formerly called The Truth, this channel seeks to better understand the fundamental nature of reality through philosophy, science, and art. We'll uncover concepts of psychology, mythology, spirituality, literature, media, and more. If you like Lex Friedman and Kurt Mongol, you'll love this education channel. Well, we definitely like both of these channels quite a bit, so it makes a lot of sense that we're here. I have no idea how I found this channel, but it's very good. I wanted to talk about his discussion with Michael Levin. It's a 3-part discussion. Here's the first one, the computational boundary of self, where they're focusing on cognitive light cones, something very relevant to my work, I think, and we'll touch on it in the future. This one is the one we're going to be talking about tonight, technological approach to mind everywhere, or polycomputing, and then round 3 is bioelectric networks as cognitive glue. All 3 of them are very good. I haven't listened to all of them through and through, just this one. I've listened to a lot of both, probably all of both, but just not in one sitting. There's so much content that he has with people who we've touched on quite a bit: Donald Hoffman, Carl Friston, and I don't recognize many others yet. But very similarly focused channel. Highly recommend that you subscribe. And we are going to probably touch on more discussions that are had on this podcast. So, like I said before, though, please hit the like button. It really helps fuel the algorithm. Share this if you think that these streams are valuable. And the link to their full discussion is down below. And as always, I recommend checking it out after this stream. So, this is the discussion that we're going to talk about: agency, attractors, observer-dependent computation, and biology and beyond. It's this part 2. But before I get on that, I do want to just go over a few things that, housekeeping stuff. I did listen to, finally got through the interview with Stephen Meyer and Joe Rogan. That one was quite interesting, and one I almost did the stream on today. Decided not to because it's very long, and I don't like. I want to focus on some more positive things, and I did like the stream, but I felt like my main points on it were critical, but not of Stephen Meyer's perspective. As you know, I tend to agree with his general assertion that we are witnessing the return of the God hypothesis. That is basically the overarching theme of this channel. But I think that just the chemistry between them was a little bit just interesting. Maybe we will do a stream about it at some point, but I recommend watching it. It is definitely interesting. I have some thoughts on it that I would like to share in the stream eventually, but that's going to be a stream that's on multiple different conversations, and aspects of that one or clips of that one will be included. But I didn't know if it was a good one for an entire, live stream to focus on solely, at least. But like I said, I recommend it. Stephen Meyer has probably the best book name I've ever heard for a philosophy of science book that has existed in the modern era. But with that, this is the stream that we will be focusing on today. And Michael Levin is a scientist who has been on Kirchai Mungel's channel a lot, that we've discussed their discussions. He is kind of a molecular biologist, you could say, and he wrote a paper that they talk about that is called The Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere. And we're going to look at this paper. I guess I'll do a very brief introduction on Michael Levin, even though we've gone over it many times, but just get to his. It says, Michael Levin is an American developmental and synthetic biologist at Tufts University, where he is the Vannevar Bush Distinguished Professor. He is the director of the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University. He's well known for his work with xenobots, which are basically programmed biological assemblies. They're kind of biological robots, and people think they're very freaky, but they are pretty remarkable as well. He also is well known for his work with planaria worms, and this is something that's also very relevant to my work because my theory suggests that planaria are not the same thing as us, basically. They're what I call a corporism, which is kind of something I call a pseudo-singularity, which it's not truly a sentient being, but it appears to be. This is just a hypothesis, and there are ways to get evidence for this, and I think that there is evidence that supports this. But nevertheless, his work with them is still pretty remarkable. This is his paper that they discuss right here. Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere, an experimentally grounded framework for understanding diverse bodies and minds. And it is amazing to see so much overlap or similarity in some of the models that are included in this paper. Here you can see this scaling of organization of mind, I guess you could say. I think that there's an issue with this, but I think that it's also in the right direction. But just even the symbolism, I guess, not even symbolism, but of the spiral tiers of biological cognition. I mean, it's pretty amazing to see where science is going. It's going in the right direction, I think. Or some of it is. This stuff is. These are planaria worms. We're not going to go through this entire paper because I haven't gone through it all, and I want to do it justice. Eventually we'll go through it. I do think that eventually what we're going to start doing is going through actual papers. We're going to go through the paper of geometric unity, go through this paper, go through papers on integrated information theory, constructor theory. We'll go through my paper that I'm working on fairly soon. That will have its own video that's not even live, but it will also be live. But I would like to eventually have the authors of these papers on while I go through them to some degree and talk about the philosophical implications of what is in the paper, because some of this stuff is difficult to interpret just from looking at equations, and even models like the ones in here, which I think are actually very good. But here, this is the paper. It is available online. I downloaded it, earlier today, and I think I might have even looked at it at some point before. But like I said, I'm not familiar enough with it for us to go through it and me to explain everything in it. But we're going to go through the stream on it, and eventually we will go probably through it more. It looks very good from the bit that I did look at, and I did, skim through it a bit. So, with that. Also, if you have a paper or a topic that you do want me to touch on at some point in the future, comment it in the comments down below, and I will add it to the list. So here is the first clip. We'll talk about what this means afterwards.
So the idea is this, and this crops up again. This will crop up again and again when we talk about the TAME framework and all of that. And it has to do with the primacy of observers and kind of an observer-centered view of things. So you can start thinking about it this way. What is a computation? What do we mean when we say something is a computation? And in particular, I've been at conferences where we spent days arguing about what that is, and some people say everything is a computation, and there was even one person who said that nothing is a computation. He was a professor of computer science. I thought that was amazing. So there's all kinds of views, but one of the real kind of issues here is that there's this general feeling that there is a truth of the matter about it. So in other words, something either is or isn't a computation, and the idea is that we could come up with a definition, and then things would either meet that definition or not, and then we would know this particular thing. Trees waving in the wind, are they computing? There would be some definition that would say yes they are, or no they're not, and that would be that. The part of and this belongs squarely in line with the TAME framework. The part of this that we're going to change is this idea that there is one unique answer to this question. And what we're going to say is that it is actually dependent on some external observer who views a set of physical events as a computation and benefits thereby. So the idea is that the computation is really in the mind of the observer or multiple observers more than it is a feature of some particular set of physical events. And so on the one hand, it makes things quite relative because it means that there could be multiple observers that look at the exact same set of physical interactions, see different things being computed, interpret them in different ways. And Josh actually and his student Atusa have some absolutely beautiful published work on this, looking at the exact same set of the exact same piece of physics and seeing multiple different computations in it. So this is actually there's actually research on this now. But so it is relative in that sense because multiple observers could disagree about what the computation is here. But it isn't anything goes because there's a clear. It's not that anything you might say about it is equally valid as anything else. It's not that because in treating it as a computation, you have to say, what does it enable you to do that you couldn't do otherwise? In other words, you have to benefit from that lens of looking at this set of, if you're going to treat a set of events as some kind of computation, you have to be able to say, what is the practical import? How did you benefit by having that? And the title of the paper is how we get into the biology of this, which is that, Feynman had this very, very famous work talking about there's plenty of room at the bottom. And what he was saying is that we build machines at certain scales, but underneath that, at the nanoscale, there's all this room for novel robotics and novel, new engineering that we're not using yet. There's plenty of room down there. Well, the thing is in biology, that's not the case because every scale is occupied. If you look at a cell, there isn't room anywhere because at every scale, from the let's say organism level down, anywhere you look, biology is already using it. It's already doing stuff at that scale, all the way down to the submolecular interactions. So that brings up an interesting question for biological evolution. If you were trying to add new functionality to a system, where would you put it? Because there isn't new room for it. And specifically, if you start making changes, let's say mutations, one of the problems is that you had a pretty well orchestrated system before. You start making changes, yes, maybe something new will appear, but you're going to wreck all your prior gains, right? All the subsystems that depend on a given system to work in a certain way, you can't just randomly make changes to it because everything else will fall apart. So that brings up an important puzzle. It's like how would evolution provide new functionality? And so what Josh and I propose in this paper is that one of the things evolution does is not just change the hardware, but it also provides new observers and new capabilities that extract more benefit from the exact same piece of hardware activity by viewing them in different ways. It's the perspective that can change. So you don't change the machine, you add different ways to interpret what that machine is doing and thereby benefit and get adaptive increases in adaptive fitness. So this is, and add some other biological examples if you want them, but that's the idea. The idea of polycomputing is that any set of events could be said to be doing many different computational things at the same time, depending on who's observing them and how do they interpret what's going on.
Okay, so this is great. I mean, this guy's work is just mind-blowing. It really is. I know Kurchai Mungel said that he thinks that Michael Levin will one day win the Nobel Prize, and I'm not somebody who really likes institutional things like that, but I will say that I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, in some ways I would, because it seems like his conclusions are actually they're so contrary to the mainstream narrative. But that's what happens when you're working at the cutting edge and you're actually making progress. But at the same time, he is working at the cutting edge and actually making progress. So I wouldn't be that surprised either. It would mean quite a shift in the direction of the institution, but towards kind of placing mind as, a fundamental construct. But what's interesting here is that basically what he's saying is something that I found in my own work very early on as well, which is that that all computation, or all intelligence is another way of putting this, is goal dependent. So, which means that it is observer dependent. It is agent dependent. It is sentient dependent, is what I would say. Maybe that's not exactly what he's saying, but I do think that it is the way that you could it's the eventuality of where you get to when you start to unpack what I think he's stating, which is that there is something about a sentient being that has a goal, and is the observer and also the kind of the actor in this computational relationship that it has with some system that allows for computation to even happen. And I say this quite a bit on here, which is just the truth, is that information requires an informer and one who is informed, someone who is informed. It is context. Information is context. It's not that there's information outside of context and information inside of context. It is that context is information. And he gets at another aspect of this later on in the stream that's very similar to the same conclusions that I had in my own work on this. But this is something that is highly related to everything from computer science to physics. And it's obvious that this is related to a lot of debates in physics about observers and things like that. It's not just a crossover of terms. It is that there is no such thing as computation that is possible outside of an observer interpreting the computation and extracting information from it, which is only able to exist in relation with a goal. And so that implies that there is a sentient agent that has a goal, because there is no such system that we are aware of, and that I would say that could exist, that is a non-sentient being, or that isn't a sentient being, that does have a goal. Every single system that you would think might have a goal, like a calculator or something like that, doesn't actually have a goal. It's the sentient being that created the calculator and uses the calculator in order to have a goal. And you can use a calculator for all different kinds of things, and even though it's the same exact system, and it's the perspective of the observer that changes what you can even do with it. I remember when I was a kid, this is just a funny example, but it might not be the best example. I doubt it is, but it's just funny. We would use the calculator for all kinds of, just math in school. And then some kids ended up figuring out that there were games that you could play on it. And then I remember that some people would just type numbers that if you flipped it upside down, it would say things like hello and, stuff like that. And of course, that's the kind of things that you find entertaining when you are in, 4th and 5th grade or whatever. But these are different things that you can do with the calculator. And what's interesting is that not all of these were programmed into the calculator, but they were possible to do with the calculator because the observer and the being that was utilizing the system had a different goal, and then therefore had a different perspective that it was looking at this information system from. And this is extremely relevant to my work with sentient singularity theory, and I talk about this a lot on here. That I took this philosophical approach mainly to this question of what is the self and what is information, and what kind of information systems does it take to get a mind that is self-aware, which I think is the only type of mind that can exist. And it was interesting because it ended up being extremely relevant to the definition of philosophy that my philosophy professor provided in college, which was that philosophy is the study of perspective. And what this is a much more, I think, useful way to think about philosophy than the love of wisdom today, because I think that if you understand why philosophy is called, often translated as the love of wisdom, is really it's what it is. It's translated as the love of wisdom. Then you've already achieved a love of wisdom, and you already achieved kind of an understanding of what it is, to some degree at least. And that doesn't really help people who are starting off with studying philosophy. So if we're not going to just have it be memorizing things that people who sound wise have stated in the past, then we want it to actually be understood as a way of thinking, I guess, or a system of study, then it really is the study of perspective. And the way that you look at things can absolutely change it changes the degrees of freedom that you have access to, which changes your abilities and changes what you can interpret and learn from a certain situation or system, and it also changes what you can do with that information and system. This has implications on everything. I can't. It's impossible for me to even say a specific one that is, very well catered to it, because there's so many and they exist on every single field. But there are applications across every field for this exact idea. And I've talked about this before, though, is that perspective allows for you to see different bits of information in a system. So this is actually, people often wonder what this is, and I haven't brought it down in a long time, but what it is, I think it's called a connectrica. It's a piece of kinetic art that and what is so interesting about this is that I can ask you different questions, and those different questions are different perspectives and goals at the same time. They're a perspective and a goal. A question is a combination of a perspective and a goal, and you can get different bits of information out of this. So if I say, do you see the square? Then you can say yes. You can see the square. And if I ask you, do you see the squares multiple? You can count and see multiplicity of squares in this system. But depending on the question that I ask you, it will give you a different answer of singularity or multiplicity. And not even that. Remember, this is actually a kinetic system. We're not taking a picture. We're not examining a picture of it anymore. We're watching a video of it, you could say. And we're seeing what it does, not just the way it's shaped. And I ask you, do you see the wave? It's like, yes. Okay. Do you see a wave? And if I ask you, do you see the helix in the center? Right there. Yes. So you can get different shapes out of a single structure. If I ask you, what shape is that structure? Which one is it? Is it made of? Is it a bunch of squares? Is it a single square? Is it a spiral? A helix basically, or is it a wave? And it's all of these things, but it depends on the question that you're asking, and it depends on the which is the perspective that you're looking at that structure from, on what you can interpret from it. And this has relevance in physics questions, and even on things that are so argued on, such as I don't know, like why you can't measure a particle's velocity and location at the same time, things like that. And this is why philosophy if we take the right perspective to take a meta approach to this on philosophy itself, and we look at it differently than we have in an academic sense in recent times, it allows for it to be helpful and useful in different fields, including physics, which I would say philosophy historically has been a central tool in physics, but lately has actually failed miserably. And but it is always an essential tool in theoretical physics, and it is not being able to be utilized because we're taking the wrong perspective even on what philosophy is. And so we have to change our perspective, and that perspective shift can allow you to see a new structure and new information that wasn't previously viewable to you. It's like these kinetic sculptures that they have where it's a bunch of hanging dots or something like that, and then it spins around, and as it like intersects at one point, like everything lines up and you can see, I don't know, the outline of the world or something like that. And then it, but it's only viewable from one perspective. Or you've got some of these sculptures which are even cooler than that, where if you look at it from this way, you'll see that it is, I don't know, a human face, and then you'll look at it from the other angle and you will see that it is a map of the world or something. And this is a very good kind of metaphor, I guess, for how information is interpreted and encoded within reality. And so we take this very kind of narrow approach to things right now, but I think that if we realize that perspective matters to every bit of interpretation that we can make, and therefore actually our computation itself, which is just what is computation? It's just information processing, and but it's information processing within the context of a question or a goal. That's what it is. When you hit compute on or equals on a calculator, you have inputted a question with a specific goal as the intention, with achieving a specific goal as the intention. And so we need to recognize that you cannot separate an observer or an agent as specifically as a participant in a system. And then I think eventually we'll get to the point where we realize that ultimately, not always proximately, but ultimately, every system, the system of existence itself, the cosmos itself, is a participant in this process as well. So, very, very interesting to hear him using these terms, though, and it's awesome to see. So, but he talks about how changing your perspective can change your abilities. Because it changes the information that you have access to. That's absolutely true. It is true in even how we interpret the world. He says at a certain point, and I'm not sure if I played it yet, but that he didn't want to sound, too self-help or anything like that. But it is absolutely true that if you change your perspective on a situation, you can change your own personal abilities in it. It's funny because in the very beginning of this project, there were certain questions that I thought I could never answer, and I actually think that I have gotten a lot of those answers, and one of them particularly was revolving around the process and kind of mathematics, you could almost say, but it's kind of more the emergence of mathematics once you figure it out. But originally I was like trying to figure out kind of the math of the beginning of creation. And that sounds extremely complicated, but the more you think about it, the more you realize like it actually should be the simplest math in the world, because it's where math emerges itself. It's where multiplicity of quantities emerges in and of itself. So prior to that, you're just at one single unit. So you're at the monad, you're at a single God, single sentient being. There is no multiplicity yet. that means that complex math doesn't even exist. So it is funny how we think that, the math at the beginning of the universe should be extremely complicated, but that's actually contrary to the logic of where that actually goes. But the point is that I remember I was just thinking about it, and I was like, that would be something that in some ways I feel like I have to try and focus on a little bit in my work. And then also it felt so out of reach just because I was assuming that it was. Then at some point I was like, you know what? For the sake of argument, just for the sake of trying, I'm going to assume that this is within my reach, and that I'm going to assume that this is actually possible for me to figure out. And guys, it took me like 5 hours. And I'm not saying I understand all the math involved with every aspect of the creation of molecules and things like that. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the math of creation of multiplicity itself, the very beginning, like the first equation. That's it. That's all I'm talking about. And it turned out that it was actually super simple. Of course it would have to be super simple. And that's part of the reason why it's so... I don't think that it's been, I don't know, more widespreadly considered, is because it's always assumed to be so complicated, wrongly so. But you have to change your perspective in order to change your abilities. I literally could not have done it if I did not assume, just for the sake of it, that it was even possible. You can't ask a question honestly if you assume that it is not able to be answered. You have to assume that it is able to be answered. So that single perspective shift of I can get that answer, it's not beyond me, can actually completely change whether or not you have the ability to answer the question. And this applies to all kinds of things. And I'm not just saying this for the sake of, self-help, like he said, he doesn't want to sound like that. But the thing is that maybe it should be applied more to that, is that you have to assume that you can improve in order to improve, because that just only makes sense. And but it applies to things beyond that. It applies to every question that you could possibly have about the world. Is you have to assume that there is an answer to that question, or if you want, there's an answer that you want, you have to assume that there is a question that would get you the answer. Sometimes you have to think about it like that, because you might have to assume that you don't have the right question in order to find the right question. And that's another, way of kind of applying that perspective shift mentality to I guess, accomplishment or computation, which is just, like I said, information processing. Everything that we do is information processing. Everything that can be done is a processing of information. And if you assume that you cannot process the information, then you can't have it. You can't start from a logical foundation of where you would need to start in order to actually process the information the way that you would want. I was listening to Joe Rogan talk to Stephen Meyer, and one of the things that stuck out to me, and I did want to touch on it a bit, but is they were talking, and Lex Friedman does this a lot too, is people bring up infinity, and it's always assumed to be beyond us, and people often say quite a bit, they'll say, they'll use the term infinity when they're talking about something that is just so beyond us. And so Joe Rogan was talking about how life could emerge or would emerge inevitably, even if it was just the product of, random, which, there's issues with that in and of itself, interactions. And he said, because there might be infinite galaxies out there. He was like, people really, it very well might be that there are infinite galaxies. And as much as I do understand where he's getting that from, it actually doesn't make logical sense when you really think about it in the way that he's probably thinking about it, which is in this kind of static yet infinite idea. But really, infinity is actually very easy to figure out. It is infinite growth of multiplicity. That's it. But it only exists in kind of a dynamic system or state. Infinity seems out of reach because we think about it as in a static form, endlessness, but also unchanging in a weird way. But that doesn't make sense. But if you think about it as, there are infinite numbers just starting from 1 and going up, that makes sense. But if you think about it in terms of there are infinite galaxies, but also we're thinking about, the reality, when you try and think about the realities of change, it doesn't really make sense, because at some point you're also claiming that there wasn't infinite galaxies. So why are there now infinite galaxies? It just doesn't hold up. But in a dynamic system where you start with 1 and you count upwards from there, like one cell grows into infinite cells potentially. That's not usually a good thing, but in maybe a cosmological sense, it makes sense. Then infinity actually comes into view. You can understand what it is. It is an infinitely growing amount. It isn't a finite amount, and now it's actually achievable to understand infinity. It's actually remarkably simple, and it fits within the context of things that we understand. But the question was wrong. But you'd have to change your perspective on what infinity means, which means you'd have to assume that your current perspective is wrong in order to change your perspective on how you approach the problem. Or you would also have to assume that you could understand it, and it's not enough to just say, well, we'll never understand infinity, and we don't have to, because infinity answers every question, because if there's infinity of anything, then therefore anything can happen. And that kind of stuff just falls apart and ends up taking kind of destroying the reasons and also the ability to answer really much of any questions. It is funny to me to see like anti-theists often invoke infinity the way that they do, because it's so much more nonsensical than any theistical argument. Even if, I'm not talking about arguments from scripture or anything like that, but just logical arguments for theism, most of them are pretty coherent, or at least a lot of them are. And the arguments, that specific argument of infinity to explain, anything, infinite universes in a multiverse, like Sean Carroll's Many Worlds type of explanation for why the universe is, the way that it is just, it is as nonsensical as anything that is nonsensical. It is just funny to me. But here, next clip, though. I really like what he said, though. It's very true. This next clip is also very good, and it is really showing the direction that I think the cutting edge of science is headed down.
Logical computation as well. I think it's a little bit later in the paper. But for those spatial to causal emergences, sort of this micro-macro dynamic that's happening there. And that figure looks very familiar to, similar to some Eric Howell's work. I'm not sure if that was like brought in.
Well, Eric was a co-author on the first gene regulatory network paper. So if that's the figure the paper you're talking about, then he was a co-author on that.
Yes. Oh, yes. I have the other paper. I don't think I have time for it today, but I did read that other paper you co-authored with him as well. So yeah, it is this. And the idea, if you could probably explain this better, but the way I understand it is that he has another paper called "When the Map is Better Than the Territory," how the macro scale can actually give you more information than just adding up all the micro scales. Can you perhaps, and I know it's a very complex, that's a whole different divergence, but could you bring that into how it applies here? Because I wasn't quite able to I can sort of see the similarity or how it's related, but if you could expound on that, that'd be really helpful.
Sure. And I'm not going to do a better job than Eric would about it.
I do want to just touch on what he just said real quick before we continue this clip. But when he said that a macro scale can give you more information than the micro scale, I'm not exactly sure if I'm interpreting what he's saying correctly, but I will say that this is what it brings to mind for me is when you watch my video Theories of Everything, the how-to guide that I made, and I talk about how physicists are trying to come up with a fundamental theory by combining two theories that are not fundamental, or that they at least both assume are not fundamental and don't appear to be fundamental. And then they're trying to get a fundamental theory from that, and it's not really working. That a better way of approaching this a fundamental theory is to start from scratch and to see what is at the very bottom, which is the same thing as saying what is at the very top. It's a map. It's a total view. Okay, and it's a fundamental view, which is a total view of everything, a God's eye view, and that you need to do that in order to contextualize everything else, because you need to create something that contextualizes all these other theories. You're not going to contextualize them by adding up the ones that already exist together, and not completely at least, which is interesting because it seems very similar to what he just said, which is that kind of you need to back up and get a bird's eye view of what's going on. It's because sometimes that will give you more information than just adding up, two little micro views together, and because it gives a greater context. It is about shifting the perspective from a limited scope to a complete view, and I thought that was interesting. It seems to resonate well with my thought process on it.
About his own work, so you could have him on. But I think his work is foundationally important. It's incredibly important work. And what he basically developed was a way to quantify and make rigorous a debate that's been going on for probably thousands of years, which is, are there any higher levels like bodies, organisms, people, things like this, or should it really be reduced to talking about molecules and atoms and whatever else is underneath? Right? I mean, people have been discussing that for a long time. And so he's found a way to quantify that, and his analysis shows that there are, and this is of course also the work of Giulio Tononi and other people like that, that with many others that have contributed to this since then, that basically have figured out that for certain kinds of systems, you actually gain more power. Power means better ways to control and predict the system, and you gain better predictive power by taking seriously these higher levels. And I'll give you just another simple example that I really like. There's this thing that many of your listeners will recognize. It's called the game of life. It's a cellular automaton. It's this big grid, right? The universe is this giant grid, and it has a very simple physics. It has each grid is a single node, and it can be either on or off. It's either bright or dark. And the way you determine whether it's on and off is you count up how many neighbors it has that are on, and then there's three simple rules that tell you whether that cell stays on or off. That's it. That's the physics. It's totally deterministic. There's nothing else in there. And so the magic that happens there is, this is John Conway I came up with this, is that if you run that world forward from certain starting configurations, you see all kinds of amazing complexity emerge. And one of the things that you see is this thing called a glider. The thing about a glider is it's a stable pattern that moves across the screen. Now, now let's keep in mind, in that world, in life world, physics, there is no such thing as a glider. All that exists are individual, you can call them molecules or something that are just on or off, and they don't move, and that's it. There's no such thing as a glider. But to our visual system, we interpret a moving pattern of, just imagine a wave of these cells turning on and off and on and off, right? So if they do that in a pattern, you see this thing moving along. So our visual system is very good at turning those kinds of events into a mental representation of an object. It's not a real object in terms of physics. It's what you might call a persistent physiological kind of state, or like a hurricane or something else, that there are the molecules of air, yes, but then there's or a wave or an ocean wave, and you got the water, but then you've also got this wave. Okay, so one thing you could do is you could be a strict kind of reductionist about that world, and you can say, look, there are no gliders. And I'll tell you why. You don't need to know about gliders in order to predict the next thing that's going to happen, because the world is totally deterministic. And if you tell me where all the on bits are at time t, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen into infinity. I just have to crank through the computation. I can tell you where everything's going to be. And this is true. However, what you don't have when you do this, if you don't believe in gliders, what you're not, yes, you can predict what happens after somebody else has set up a clever pattern for you. But what you're not going to do is invent a pattern in that environment that creates a Turing machine using gliders as a way to move bits around. Somebody did that. Somebody actually did that. They created it, and it's incredible. They created a computer inside of LifeWorld, and it uses these gliders to send signals around. That's the thing. It's not that the determinists, once you give them this amazing setup, it's not that they can't tell you what happens next. They can. They would never have made one because they don't believe in gliders. And so this once again gets you back. I know it's a little bit away from what you asked about Eric, but Eric's work, but I think it's important. It's the idea that you can quantify prediction and control, and it's very awesome that his system gives you a way to say that in certain systems, knowing about these higher levels and looking at gliders as opposed to, and I actually don't know if anybody's done this exactly for the game of life, but this kind of thing, that knowing about these kind of higher levels, like for example in biology, you might say knowing about organs as opposed to just gene expression states, or knowing about persistent physiological states, maybe stress states, maybe waves, maybe calcium waves propagating through tissue, maybe electrical waves, whatever. Knowing about these things gives you extra power. But what we don't yet have a way of quantifying, and I think, I've been talking, I have a new postdoc coming that we've talked about doing this project next, is actually trying to come up with a quantification of the next step, which is not just prediction, but actually the inventiveness part, the generative part. Mm-hmm. Like, right, how much power does a certain lens give you to invent new stuff, as opposed to just say what pre-existing stuff is going to do next. I think it's really important going to the future. I mean, it's a super hard problem. I don't have a solution for it yet in my head, but I think it's really important. We don't really have, but I think that's the evolution. That's the next evolution of the kind of thing that Eric did.
Okay, so lots of thoughts on this, but first one is when he says that you can have more power by understanding basically the system that you're in from a more macro view of things. When you understand, when you're not just reducing everything down to these little micro bits, but you actually realize the macro bit, the existence of the macro bit, it can provide you with certain powers, is the word that he used. But it reminds me of a specific term in the Torah, in the Bible, and it's one of my favorites, and it obviously should be, which is that wisdom begins with fear of God, or kind of, I like to say, reverence, or reverence for God, basically, which is like a awareness of the existence of another sentient being that you're within and subject to at the same time. So you're not just aware that it exists, but you're also aware of your own subjectivity to this being in a hierarchical relationship, and that's probably why it's translated as fear, but it is just recognition of. I don't know if that gives the right perspective on it, but it's just reverence, I guess. That your realization that this sentient being is the environment that you exist in, and that you therefore, because of that, you are subject to its will, and your wills do not overcome its will in the end, because it just can't. And so that I always thought that was just such an amazing, I guess, just verse, but and I didn't really understand it until I had started this work and just realized kind of more of the structure of everything, and why that would be actually an inevitability. And if wisdom isn't a power, then I don't know what is. I mean, wisdom allows for you to know that there is something you must contend with beyond the immediate state of things. So it is what allows you to know that things are probably a bad idea sometimes, when they might not appear to be a bad idea in the moment. And that's the difference between somebody without wisdom and somebody with wisdom, is that one of them can see the immediate situation, and the other one can see the immediate situation and also the consequences beyond the immediate situation. That is what wisdom is. And the way in which you would gain universal wisdom, that doesn't mean total wisdom. It just means like wisdom across many situations, not just specific to, I don't know, like race car driving or something like that, is just by recognizing the nature of the system that you are constantly within, and that is why I think that phrase, that verse in the Bible makes so much sense. Wisdom begins with, I would say, reverence for God more so than fear. But it is there. You have to recognize that hierarchical relationship. If you don't, then it's not. Just because you recognize that you're within a sentient being, if you don't internalize and realize that means that you're subject to that being, just as your cells are subject to you, then it's gonna, I think, lead you to probably just issues, situations that arise from a lack of wisdom. But I think that phrase is very relevant to what he just said, and it's very applicable. It is entirely applicable. But when he's talking about these gliders, though, what's also very interesting is this next statement where he's talking about the game of life, and in this game of life, there's just very simple rules, and they all coalesce eventually to gain this structure that is called the glider, which is this kind of unified monolithic structure that moves as one. And in my work, I believe that this manifestation of a glider is what I call a corporism, which is it on the biological level, which is like a planaria, or probably most plants, maybe not all plants, but most plants, or a corporation on the assembly level, of multiple organisms. You would have a corporation as the inevitability of that. Maybe you could call it a state, but it's a little difficult to right now figure out exactly what is a state and what or nation and what is not. But I would say that a true nation is different than a corporation, and what most people call nations today, or states, are actually just corporations, more so than they are actual nations. So, but that we'll save that for another day. But they are gliders. A corporation is a glider, I believe, and so would be a corporism, which it would be an assembly of cells that appears to be a sentient being, but is actually not. But they do move in a unified fashion and are assembled in a way that makes them appear as one entity. But it arises not due to some very specific assembly pattern that unifies them actually into a single entity, but actually just due to the inevitabilities of mathematical interactions, and that they're not actually sentient. And I didn't know that this structure called a glider existed before watching this interview. But what's interesting is that it actually does support my idea on corporisms and corporations, and I think that this scales down as well. That there are some molecules that would be similar to this and such. But that there is kind of this dualistic assembly structure. One of them is actually observers that are able to, be self-aware and observe their environment. And the other one is one that appears to be a single entity, but is actually an assembly that is not due to this kind of metaphysical consensual entanglement that we can talk about on another episode, which I think is how you get like a multicellular organism from a bunch of single cells, and but is one that is not due to the any individual like single choice. It's really just due to the eventuality of inevitable mathematical constraints. And this is similar to what Eric Weinstein calls the ego, the embedded growth obligation, and it's kind of what causes the the manifestation of corporations in the first place, and is that their interaction with this ego, this embedded growth obligation that is basically a bunch of mathematical inevitabilities that are forcing a system into a certain way, and forcing the actors into a certain system, even if that assembly or that space of interacting beings, each individual being does have a choice because of the way that the system is organized. Even if somebody opts out of the playing along with whatever the system is incentivizing, the system is still incentivizing it to such a degree that someone else will eventually not opt out, and therefore you do have the manifestation of this inevitable assembly structure that is not sentient and is actually, it's a pseudo singularity, which is a glider, and that's why you don't need, like, you could not have multicellular organisms arise in the game of life because of the nature of the game it's not founded on quantum rules. It's and not built on a single sentient being, the construct that it is within, which is a computer, a traditional computer, not a quantum computer, is one of binary bits that create a space of complete determinism that is absent of any degrees of freedom. Yet these singular looking entities do arise that are now, I've found out, called gliders, and it just shows that the fact that they can arise in a non-sentient system or in a system that is absent sentience other than an observer, those little things in life, those little cellular automata type of simulated rules, those are not sentient beings, and yet still there is this assembly structure that is generated that appears to be a kind of a single entity at a certain point, but that really does, it's amazing. That supports my hypothesis about corporisms, and it supports why corporations would be inevitable and things like that, which is a corporation is a system of an organized assembly structure of individual actors that is actually kind of run by the mathematical inevitabilities of the system itself. It's not a single actor that can make choices in and of itself. This is why when people say things like, "Oh, why is Disney doing this, and why would Coca-Cola do that?" And I had this question as well when I started working for a startup many years ago, and that then I watched grow and succeed and eventually fall to the same exact incentive structures that every other bigger company falls to, and I watched it lose its ability to make choices in the environment. It lost its ability to innovate because of this, because it no longer was able to be unified and act in a sentient fashion. It was just a reactive, like construct at that point, like a calculator. And I asked myself for quite a while, like, it was very disappointing to me because I had been there at the start of this and I had tried to stop this process and it did not work. And I was wondering, what causes this, and I have quite a bit of ideas about it, and but it has to do with a lack of unification of the beings in the assembly, but what it does do is, on an emotional level, I guess you could say, which is a total level, like versus just being, it creates a situation where they're just subject to the incentives of the market, and when that happens, you get the same exact patterns in corporations again and again and again. It's like, why do all these corporations go along with this this movement and that movement and that movement and that movement, and why can't they innovate and change, and why is Disney making terrible movies again and again and again when they can't, it's got to be impossible for them to not realize that this stuff is, terrible, but yet it doesn't seem possible for them to reverse course and actually like change the company. And it's because it's not a being that is actually subject to any one single individual's will anymore, really. It has no will. It's just, reacting to incentive structures in the market, and which is just inputs, and that is a wave. It's a glider. It's just a wave that isn't a single entity. It's not a single sentient entity that with self-awareness. It has no self-awareness. That's what the problem comes down to, is that because it's not self-aware, it can't actually course correct because it has no goal. So it's not even missing the goal. But this is basically an inevitability, it seems, in the game of life, which is just amazing. It makes me want to actually like explore it more. I've only looked into it a little bit years ago, and the fact that is a structure that arises in it means that it has nothing to do with sentience, and it has everything to do with just deterministic math. That's mind-blowing. So let's check the chat. Please hit the like button if you find this interesting, if you think this is valuable. Also, like I said, let me know in the chat what you think of the time and the day, Sundays at about 3 p.m. Pacific. So let's see here. Meaning rather than abridged. Maybe we could all put our heads together as a group and translate the CTMU for the layman. One day I would like to see that happen. I mean, it's not even that it's not translated for the layman. It's just that you must make new terms for a fundamental theory, and that means that you must get on board with the terms, and which means like with the theory, even just for the sake of exploring it. And it means it's basically off limits to somebody that doesn't intentionally try to understand it. The other guy's audio is unintelligible. Okay, I will try and figure that out. Can you talk about what's going on inside of Schrodinger's cat's box? I think that the entire thing, that entire thought experiment is ridiculous. I think it's been misinterpreted, even if it made sense in a specific context in which it was originally stated. The way in which it is described now, it makes zero sense. Any physicist who explains it on any podcast that you see and claims to understand it, that is a mainstream physicist, at least. Maybe there are people that do understand it and they're not usually mainstream. I would very much like to, listen to that argument that they're making about what it means, because every single one that I've ever seen is nonsense. And it's very obvious they do not understand it. They're just like, don't you understand that it's dead and alive at the same time? It kind of makes sense that basically you could say the cat is an assembly and a singularity at the same time, and whether you, depending on the perspective that you look at it, you could see it as a single entity or as a collection of cells. Maybe that does make sense, but to look at it and say, oh, it is dead and alive at the same time, is nonsense. And because it also another reason why this doesn't work with this specific example, but also couldn't work with another example, is because any living being is in and of itself an observer of itself, and therefore is constantly observing itself. So it doesn't matter as much. Our observation of the cat is not as important as the cat's observation of the cat. And so the cat cannot be dead if it is observing itself as alive. And so we cannot observe it as dead either, because it cannot be dead. If the cat is observing itself as alive, then it is alive. And so and you cannot do this with any non-living being, because how are you going to say some non-living being is dead and alive at the same time? But then also that if you always do use a living being, then it means that it is observing itself at the same time. So there is no lack of an observer, even if it's closed up in a box, because the primary observer is in the box, observing itself. So it just is absolute insanity. I think that it was stated, and maybe it made sense in a specific context when it was originally said, but it has been misinterpreted if it did make sense at a certain point, and now it makes no sense. It is something we need to stop saying. I absolutely despise it. It's funny, I was watching a show with my wife the other night. I forgot what it was. I think gosh, I can't remember what it was. But in it, they showed a physicist, and she's, in front of everyone. And it was Flight. No, not Flight. Hijacked, the new show on Apple TV. Very good, I will admit. Actually, Apple TV's shows are killing it. They are the best shows that I've seen on any kind of platform in a long time. All of them. And I've been watching Hijacked. And they show a physicist in it, and she's in front of the college class, and she's like, Schrodinger's cat, and she's like talking about it, and I paused it, and I explained to my wife why it was such nonsense. So it's funny that you say this, because I'm pretty sure that I did this just Friday night or yesterday. But I hate that thought experiment, because I think nobody who is saying it actually understands it. I think that they're just saying it because it's been said to them, and it shows the mysteriousness of physics and quantum mechanics, and it doesn't at all. It absolutely shows the nonsensical parroting that is going on in the physics world. But let me see. Can you? So yeah, that's my take on Schrodinger's cat. Like, what if there was a video tape inside of the system like that? Wouldn't even the footage on the tape DVR be indeterminate until a conscious observer looks at it? Yeah, I mean, you couldn't put the tape on any images on the tape, any video on the tape without a conscious observer making the tape in the first place. So it's just there's no way for information to exist outside of context, because it is context, and it is contextualized by sentience, by a sentient being always. What's up, memes? Do swarms such as grasshoppers and plankton count? I think that they are even lower than a corporism, and those are even lower than like a hive organism, a hive assembly, like bees and wasps, like a eusocial type of system, like ants and bees and wasps and things like that. But a swarm is it's no different than than a stampede of people, basically. I mean, we see swarms of, go to a concert, you will see people as a swarm. I think that is similar to a glider, actually, but it's not even quite a glider. It's like a temporary synchronicity event where like a bunch of individual entities are all of a sudden, because of the system incentives that are around them, all of a sudden they'll like move together real quick, but then they break apart again. That is like a swarm. But it's not the same thing as like a glider, which I would say is like a self-perpetuating system, probably more so, which is like a corporation would be a glider. That's the best. And also I think even most plants are probably gliders, which is just really weird to state. But we'll get into that another day. But and I think even planaria worms are gliders. They just, the fact that you can chop them into a bunch of pieces and they just make more of them is the same thing as when you take a corporation and you chop it up and it makes, a bunch of different ones. And you can't do that with you. You can't just chop you up and make a bunch of different ones. And if you could, then I think that it would imply that your sentience no longer exists, even if it appears to. And so it's, we're going to have to come up with other types of experiments to look more into the evidence for differentiating pseudo-singularities from sentient singularities, or corporisms from organisms, and gliders from unified beings. But one of the proposals that I will make by, soon when I release my paper and later this year is I'm going to talk more about an idea I have for an experiment to test this. But I'm not saying it will prove things, but it will add information and evidence for sure to this idea. But there's already information and evidence that supports this idea. But like I said, the fact that you can chop up an organism into a bunch of different pieces and it forms individual entities that continue is evidence to suggest that these are pseudo-singularities or corporisms. You can do this to trees and plants a lot of times too, like pothos plant, which is the most common house plant. You just chop it up, put each leaf in a different jar of water, and it will make a bunch of pothos plants. This implies that it is not a single sentient entity. It is some type of assembly structure that looks like a single unified entity, like a glider in the game of life. It's good. I usually have very casual Sunday schedule. Good. Okay, point taken about the cat being an observer, but please read the rest because that was only brought up as an example of retrocausal system could do it differently. You're addressing it different. Yeah, I think I did address it with the tape. Schrodinger's cat experiment, flawed though it may be, was only to illustrate what's going on. Well, it wasn't an experiment, but to illustrate what's going on with sensors, things in states of superposition before a conscious observer is added into the loop. Yeah, I know, but that's what I'm saying is it doesn't work with a cat because a cat is a conscious observer of itself, and so superposition does exist. I showed it with this earlier. Superposition is it is a matter of changing your perspective on things. So think about this. It's like when we think about elementary particles, and which are really points, they are different points of focus, basically, like or points of force. In the case of quarks, I call them force points. In the case of electrons, I call them focus points, and when we have this issue where we try and measure their position and their velocity at the same time, and people will say, well, it's a wave and it's a particle at the same time. How can this happen? But when you adjust your perspective on it, you take yourself into account, and you realize that focus in and of itself, the act of focusing is necessary to make an observation. And in the act of focusing, you are focused on one thing because that is what focus means by definition. Then it's like if you're looking at a wave in the ocean and you have like a very, very long tube that you're looking through it, and it's a camera, let's say, and you go and you have to take a picture of the wave at that point right there. And so you take a picture and it shows this is the position of it, and it shows it as a little particle, but it's really a point on a wave, and you're not seeing the greater whole because you're not focused on it properly. But then but it shows it to you as a static structure, or as a static object, or as a static observation. It has a position. But then if you go and you zoom out and you look at this and you realize that it's a wave that has this geometric pattern to it, essentially, and now you go and you try and measure its velocity, or its position, not its velocity, or you try and look at its movement, which is its velocity. You cannot also look at its position, because to look at its position is to imply that it is static in the first place, and to look at its velocity is to imply that it is moving, and so you must look at it as a moving wave, essentially. So you can't. These are two different questions that you're asking about the same structure, and you're looking at from two different views.